Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event. Let's take 2 more minutes so that we allow also other colleagues to join. Thank you very much again for participating in this event. So maybe I can just start very slowly. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event on corporate accountability, biodiversity, agribusiness, and human rights trends in Asia. The event is organized by UNDP, the Food and Agriculture Commodity Systems community and team in partnership with the Business and Human Rights team. Thank you very much for joining today. My name is Greta Ellero. I'm a Coordination Associate Officer at UNDP Food and Agriculture Community Systems team. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as well. So let me just start by some quick technical aspects. The workshop is recorded. The recording will be available to you all together with all the presentations that will be shared by our speakers today through a post-event email. So don't worry, feel free anytime to put questions and comments in the chat. So today we're gonna focus on the latest biodiversity challenges in Asia and their linkages to the rapidly emerging business and human rights agenda, including the upcoming Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive from the European Union. In addition, the event is an opportunity to present efforts to mitigate those risks, targeting businesses in the agriculture sector. So today, without further ado, I will give the floor to Martina Bottola, Senior Advisor Sustainability at the International Trade Center. She will provide an overview of the European Union Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the pilot on accompanying measures to mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence requirements. Martina, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greta, and thank you to the organizer for putting effort and organizing this very important event on the network. So I'm now sharing my screen. Good. Here we are. So in this part of the presentation, we discuss the concept of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence with focus on a directive currently under discussion in the European Union and the experience that at the International Trade Center with several partners. It's also with us today, Fairtrade International, who partner in this experience together also with CLAC, the International Coffee Organization, the European Union, and also the member states of the European Union, such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. So this presentation, I like in this presentation first to give an overview. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is part of a group of policy initiatives that together belong to the European Green Deal policy initiative on global supply chain sustainability. Often there is confusion among these new, as we are transitioning from voluntary to mandatory framework, there is emergence of these new laws. There is a bit of confusion between regulation, directive. So to simplify, let's simplify and say there is an umbrella of legal instruments, all have a common purpose, that is to bring forward the sustainability agenda, to contribute to sustainability, to the different pillar of sustainability in different sector or through different angles, let's say. So it's just one of those. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, in particular, has covered human rights and environmental impact. Very important and often not fully known is that it doesn't add up new requirement, but it refers to international convention already existing. And among these international convention, I know the interest of today's event, it's a lot on biodiversity. So indeed, Annex 1, it's one can find it online, list, very important, particularly is part 2, very important convention covering also biodiversity aspect. To name, for example, 2, the Convention of Biological Diversity, and also the CITES, so the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species in Wildlife, Fauna and Flora, that cover, species much less known, but also very iconic species such as rhinos and rhino horn and elephant tusks. Now, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, what is the scope if this will get through in the text as it is proposed now? As I was saying, unfortunately, this hasn't yet landed, so some changes, although unlikely, may still happen. But the status quo is, without going too much in detail, that the in scope, so this directive refer specifically to large company based in Europe or with large turnover and employee number in Europe. At this point, you may be wondering then why it is relevant in a webinar, focusing on supporting stakeholders based in Asia. Because this directive said it clearly that its obligations extend to the full value chain, including producer, micro, medium, small enterprise along the value chain. So it means that the in-scope directive have to comply, put it simply, have to comply with human rights, environmental due diligence requirement along the value chain, make sure that all the actors they engage with are compliant. And so that's how it extends. Without, again, going too much in detail, I want to emphasize one point, how human rights and environmental due diligence work. This is not meant to be a pass or fail exercise. This is really meant in the way it's foreseen by this directive, and not only by this directive, as a process where different actors have to engage together. How along the value chain we can embed responsible business conduct in our policy and management. For some companies have something like a code of conduct. It's a given. For some other actors, maybe smaller actors, they may not even have the knowledge of what is a code of conduct, why it's important. So it becomes a value chain responsibility to engage so that everyone can play on the same field, at least on the basic knowledge and requirement. And then, of course, if we want to identify risk, we have to identify risk, adverse impact, try to seize and prevent those. For example, if we do something that undermines greatly biodiversity in a location or doesn't respect the Convention on Biodiversity, Diversity, or the CITES, how do we act in order to mitigate or prevent adverse impact, track what we do, communicate, and continue collaborate. So in order to do this process, we need to do it participatory. No one can do it alone. Where do we stand? I was saying this is a proposed, is not out there yet. So whatever I say so far, there may be still some changes, but the direction is that. And that's the important question, the important comment. So the directive has been proposed, has been extensively discussed between the different organs of the European Union, so the Council, the Parliament, what is called the trilogue, and at the moment, so they came with a compromise text between the Council and between the trilogue, the different organ in charge, without going too much in detail. But at the moment, in order to be adopted fully, it has to be approved by the Parliament and by the European Council that represent all the governments of the member state. And that's a bit where we are at the moment. Negotiations are very fervid, and we are in the middle of it. You may know or not that soon there will be European election in Europe. So the idea is it's very important that this goes through before we get too close to the European election. Otherwise, discussion will be postponed, and this is also a possibility. So that's where we stand. Nonetheless, I just say that's the scope of this is human rights, environment. So that's something that it's very important to be still. We need to prepare to this. First of all, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is not the only one that at the moment look at this topic. There is really a trend on, looking at this topic, look how, the voluntary framework we had so far brought forward the sustainability agenda. But there is often the feeling not enough. And that's why the policymaker and civil society pressure to do more. That's not the only one. For example, we have in Europe, we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is very much linked to the CSDDD I just described, regulation on deforestation-free product, new batteries, critical minerals regulation. Those are all regulation directive that, kind of belong to the same family. So we need to prepare. That's the message. And that's not only a European trend. We see in the US very clearly, with also some federal state moving forward faster than others, such as California. We see also in Asia, for example, we have a proposed bill on human rights and environmental protection for sustainable business management in South Korea. So there is need, whether, a single directive go through fast or doesn't, there is need for implementation guidance, accompanying measure on this. With the important things that indeed we may have and foster through this more collaboration through the value chain. We may have export potential. If you comply, then it creates potential to be more competitive for those markets that are adopting such legislation, regulation. We have opportunity to improve production processes to origin to the collaboration. Remember, I told about the process support along the value chain, and also promote the transition toward more sustainable value chain, that is a more just value chain, that is the goal. Of course, we also have to look into the potential negative impact and work together to avoid that, such as, if I am a buyer and the destination is very risky, that doesn't comply, what do? I may switch to destinations that do comply, that are easy to demonstrate that comply, so I don't get into trouble. So we have to foresee and prepare everyone so that no one is left behind. And then the big elephant in the room. This is costly. Who pays? How do we share cost? Important to say, we should not reinvent the wheel. A lot of good work exists together. We can link to this topic and build upon that. The European Union, also with the support of the International Trade Center, other organizations at work. This is free resource available online. If you're interested, you can Google or contact me for link on framework document on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And we are currently working with stakeholders to frame a discussion. So what do you need to prepare? And here you see different families of accompanying measure. So you need maybe practical tools for supply chain management, risk assessment, and reporting. Let's unpack this. And then we work with different actors in countries, supply chain, to unpack this aspect and to see how, first, to raise awareness. This is coming. What is this about? You cannot prepare about something you don't know. And second, to really work and prepare together. So for this, we have been doing some pilots. But basically, we raise awareness. We work very closely with stakeholders to map them, to make sure we are truly inclusive, to do a bit of capacity diagnostic. So where do we stand? Raise awareness about this, and then support actors so that they take the lead and they develop value chain action plan and identify accompanying measure of priority. It's not me going on mission 3 days in a country and decide what their priority is, but it's the stakeholders that are informed, are empowered, and they come and bring at the table in a constructive discussion, what they see as priority. We work with a range of actors. This is just to say public sector, private sector, regulator, and private sector along the value chain on pilots that actually are just finishing. So now we are moving more into the implementation stage. So to date, the pilots has focused in Latin America and Africa, but several of the lessons learned are valuable and are input also to our partner in order to also for Asia. And we did actually several events at global level, also for stakeholders in different value chain. For example, I did myself a few with stakeholder based in Asia, working in coffee. Now, what do we see? We see that bottom-up and top-down approach is required. What does it mean? It means dialogue that starts from the big buyers in Europe. How do they see it? How do we engage their value chain? Dialogue that start with the producers in isolated area. How do they see this once they are informed? What do they need? How do we map their value chain up? We need in this to have this move from voluntary to mandatory, to strengthen the agenda, but we need to do it participatory, and we need to give agency a voice to those actors that may not have always. In general, there is a lack of knowledge. You cannot prepare about something you don't know or you don't know well. For example, a lot of thinking that this include new requirements. That's not the case. That's referred to convention already signed. And also, of course, need to co-investment and co-action of all the partners. And I like now to give the word to one of our partner who's who will deep dive a bit more into a new plan program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martina, for your very interesting presentation. If you have any questions for Martina, please put them in the chat. Now we will give the floor to Fairtrade, and after that we can respond to your questions before jumping into the next part of the workshop. So now I will give the floor to Mary Ersk-Fischer, Human Rights Advisor from Fairtrade International. She will share about the Facilitating Rights Holder Dialogue in Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence project. She will give a specific insights from the experience in Asia. Mary, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to attend this webinar today and talk about this pilot project on facilitating rights holder dialogue in HREDD. And yes, you can move to the next slide, please. Before I actually start talking about the pilot, I just want to go back a little bit to what Martina was saying and also mention that we at Fairtrade have been long time advocating for mandatory legislation in HREDD. Our focus as the smallholder farmers are really at the center of what we do. We have been focusing on some specific demands for the legislation that complement what the other civil society organizations have been pushing for, such as the inclusion of purchasing practices in the directive. This means that companies actually need to critically look at their own purchasing practices and business models and see how that affects their business partners. And also what has been very important for us is to have mention of living income as a human right in the directive alongside with living wages. Obviously, this means that if it's not included, it's sort of excluding a lot of people from the scope of the law that are non-wage workers. We have also pushed for responsible disengagement, and this means that there are clear rules for companies to exit a business relationship, because we really want to emphasize that it's done as a last resort when all the different measures have been taken, and only at that stage the company can exit. And what is important for this pilot project that I'm going to talk about is the meaningful stakeholder engagement. So important that in all phases of the HREDD process, rights holders are listened to very carefully. And this work we've been doing together with other organizations such as the Fairtrade Advocacy Office, Solidaridad, and Rainforest Alliance. And as we know, the December compromise is actually very good in terms of what our key asks. All of them are included, and so we have our fingers crossed so that the CSDDD will actually pass. Then please click a few words of our system, just to give you a bit of background. So we actually work with more than 2 million farmers and workers from 70 countries. We collaborate with 2,600 brands and more than 4,000 manufacturers and traders. We have 3 producer networks. Martina was also referring to them in her presentations. One is in Latin America, another one in Asia Pacific, and then in Africa. And these are really super important for us because these staff members are so close to the farmers and workers, and they support them in different sustainability questions. On the other hand, we have the national fair trade organizations that support the buyer companies in their HREDD journey. So I think we can quite easily say that we are in a very good position between the producers and the companies to bring an opportunity to facilitate direct dialogue, which brings us to the next slide and to the pilot project. So we have just started actually 2 months ago, a 2-year project, which aims to facilitate meaningful dialogue among supply chain actors and to design a scalable approach for facilitating such dialogue. In our project, we have 5 supply chains, 2 of them in Asia. So we focus on cane sugar in Philippines and cotton in India. So basically, this means that we will identify a farmer cooperative, let's say in India, working in cotton, and then a buyer in that supply chain buying from that produce organization. And then we bring in this project those partners together in direct dialogue. The whole idea is that the voice of the rights holders is strengthened, and they really have the opportunity to influence the HREDD practices in their supply chain. You can click. We have the pleasure to work with 3 advisory partners, Alliance for Water Stewardship, International Trade Center, and Oxfam Business Advisory Service. And the project is funded through ISIL Innovations Fund, supported by the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO, and also the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then on the next slide, I will explain shortly some key aspects of the project. So basically, we emphasize capacity building a lot. So building the capacity of the producers and their communities, meaning that we will talk about human rights, we will talk about HREDD, what meaningful stakeholder engagement means. In the project, we also help the producer organization to conduct a risk assessment and come up with some concrete mitigation and prevention measures that are then also communicated to the buyer company. We are in a way lucky because we've already worked so long on HREDD that we have had the time to come up with different materials supporting stakeholders in value chains to conduct HREDD. We have some guides targeted at different audiences. We've also published a fair trade risk map, which looks at risks in commodities and countries where fair trade works, and also puts a lot of emphasis on the root causes. And then we also have some Excel-based risk assessment tools that can be used when the producer organization is conducting its risk assessment. And all these tools are also available for everybody, so I can put some links in the chat later. And then, of course, we shouldn't forget about the building of the capacity of the buyer companies. And for this one, I would really like to emphasize that one of the topics of the meetings and workshops with the buyer companies is, of course, looking collaboratively at the purchasing practices of the company. And then the sort of the main thing of the project is obviously the dialogue events, which most likely will take place online, where we test the facilitation methodology that we are going to develop in the framework of this project. So what kind of methods we as a sustainability scheme can use to facilitate a direct dialogue. And obviously, in this dialogue, we hope that partners learn from each other and they come to a shared understanding of the situation and co-create action plans. And then finally, if you go to the next slide, I wanted to share some insights. Obviously, as I said, we are just at the beginning of our pilot project, but we're really enthusiastic about this because we will be testing a direct dialogue approach, which really aims at two-way information sharing. So if we think of, for instance, some survey tools available where companies gets information and data from the rights holders. We believe that this is slightly different because the aim is really that the producer organizations know where the data they are submitting is used for, and they have equal opportunity to influence the prevention and mitigation measures of their operations. We will be looking into the role of the facilitator. As I said, we as Fairtrade, we feel that we are in a good position to facilitate a safe and trust environment for this kind of dialogue to happen. But obviously, this is quite new to us as well. So we will be looking at how this works and whether we can have this kind of a facilitator role. As I said, also capacity building will be key. We believe that it's very hard to have a meaningful dialogue if the partners are not having enough information on what it means to actually be part of the dialogue. What is HREDD, etc. One concrete example also that already came to us was that one of the producer organizations was explaining that they were a bit afraid of what kind of consequences there would be if they started to be engaged in a dialogue project, which is very much increasing transparency. So, being more transparent of the adverse impact, the risks, what kind of consequences there could be in terms of their relationship with the buyer. So these are things that we need to also take into account in our project. And finally, when we develop our methodology and we test, we ask feedback, we document, we really want to develop something which is scalable. Obviously, this is something we test now in 5 supply chains, but we want to actually have this methodology so that it can be used also in other supply chains and in other industries. So it can be then used also by other sustainability schemes than Fairtrade. Yeah, that's all. So thanks for the opportunity, as I said, to be here and briefly talk about the pilots. And maybe in 2 years' time, I'll be here again and I will have more insights to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And yeah, you will be welcome here again in 2 years to present the results. So if you have any questions again for Martina and Mary, please feel free to put them in the chat. At the moment, I don't see any specific questions. Thank you, Kelly, for sharing more some links, useful links. Actually, here is a question from Sheila. I'm wondering what's the progress of uptake on HREDD among Asian companies based on your observations. Mary, if you would like to to quickly respond, and then we go into the second session.
Sorry, thank you very much for the question. I would maybe not be able to respond to this question right away. What I know that for our supply chains, it's going to be very different. We have different commodities. We have different sizes of companies that will be engaging in the supply chain. So I believe that there will be also companies that are in very different stages in their HREDD work. So and as Martina was also saying, that now that the legislative framework is changing, that there are also more laws coming up in Asia. I think that would also sort of speed up the readiness of picking up the HREDD. So this is a rather general response, but I am afraid I can't give more details at this point.
Thank you. And one more question is, how are you socializing your work among fair trade brands?
I don't know if I fully understand what socializing means, but if I got it right, but we have the national fair trade organizations in various countries in the sort of global north, and all these national fair trade organizations do a lot of work with brands and with retailers, with buyer companies, in explaining, also trying to encourage them to pick up the HREDD, focusing on purchasing practices, focusing on shared responsibility and all this. So I think it's work which is ongoing, and those brands that are in part of our system are already sort of taking one step forward, because they are probably a bit more aware of the sustainability issues than another one which is not. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mary. There is another question in the chat from Barbara. I suggest that we can answer in writing, so that we now pass into the second part of the event. So now I will give the floor to Sean List, the Business and Human Rights Specialist from our UNDP Asia Pacific Regional Office. He will talk about the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. He will describe a very interesting series on focusing on Asia. The team developed, and then the nexus of business, human rights, and biodiversity, and the pathways offered by the UN Guiding Principles. Sean, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting me. And really a big thanks to Martina and Mary for their presentations as well. And in fact, before I start this slide deck, I'd like to say a few opening remarks based on Martina and Mary's presentation. Going back to Martina, indeed, the CSDDD is the ultimate terms are not finalized, they are not agreed. It looks a bit rocky there in Brussels with regards to an agreed directive. Still, I want to say that what happens in the EU matters a lot. It matters a lot to pulling other regions in that direction. It gives them a major incentive. In particular, it gives a major incentive to sustainability professionals inside large agriculture companies, inside large food and agricultural companies, to say to their senior management, we need to start being more transparent. We need to start tracking our risks. We need to start mitigating our impacts if we want to have access to the European market. It's a huge incentive. I can't understate that. At the same time, what happens in the EU is not the only thing that matters. And indeed, as Mehdi was saying, there are mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence measures being explored today in Asia, notably in Thailand. There's been a national action plan that commissioned a study on the readiness of Thai companies and for national legislation. In Japan, there are guidelines on human rights due diligence. It skips over the environmental segment, but there are guidelines that are being issued also to Japanese companies. And myself, having been to Japan several times and advising large companies in the food and beverage industries, at least, like Suntory and Kao and Ajinomoto, these companies are taking this matter very seriously. In fact, they're deploying teams to places like Indonesia and other what we call supplier countries to make sure they understand what new expectations are coming from Japan for Japanese, not necessarily market access, but for Japanese compliance with their company's law there. Now, we also didn't mention the Germany Supply Chain Act, which is now a live issue. It is in play at this moment. So human rights due diligence, to the extent that it's described there, is also in play. But I'd also like to just go back to the foundations. The foundations for human rights and arguably environmental due diligence, they begin with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I'm going to discuss that here momentarily. But Sheila, can I get the first slide? Take you through our agenda. Or maybe the second slide, that is. There we go. My name is Sean Lees. I'm a business and human rights specialist at UNDP Asia Pacific. I've been programming on business and human rights for the last 7 years here. And I'm joined by a team of 10 specialists who are operating in 7 countries in Asia. I will be talking about the guiding principles here shortly. I promise to make it brief. And then I'll talk a little bit about our Asian focus series, a little bit about the nexus that series is trying to unpack between business, human rights, and biodiversity. And then we'll talk a little bit about the pathways offered by the UN Guiding Principles before I hand off to Rohit Bhatnagar, our senior researcher at Dalberg, who is the primary author of an upcoming report that we have called Biodiversity and Business. Right, so look out for that report shortly. Look, in the course of there we go. First slide here. I was going to say a few more things about due diligence, but I think before unpacking the many things I want to say about it, I want to just leave you with this thought that sometimes our compliance efforts may get too far ahead of us, and we need to come back, and that benefits everyone. So while indeed the EU CSDDD is in a rocky state at this moment, and while indeed there are other initiatives out there that are happening, that due diligence is alive and well, I'm not entirely sure that this pause is a bad thing. There's a lot of talk here in Asia, where Sheila and myself sit, that are concerned about the impact of some of these compliance measures. And we know they're grouped into at least 3 things. One, as Martina said, sorry, I'm scratching your name. As Martina says, there might be a gravitation towards destinations that comply with due diligence over those destinations that don't. What does that translate in? What does that actually mean? It means buyers will go to the global north countries for those supplies they don't have over global south countries, and therefore poverty reduction efforts might be mitigated. Martina also said we might be leaving others behind. What we think that might mean, because it's being discussed here in Asia to a great extent, is there's going to be a consolidation of industries, a consolidation of small and medium-sized enterprises, and indeed it could be a consolidation of farm holdings. And the small farm holder, a small landholder, may in fact be crushed by all these compliance measures that might be coming down. So indeed, our position still remains that CSDDD, human rights due diligence, UN guiding principles are all very important, and we need to get behind them. It's not a bad thing for us to pause now and then to actually examine in detail what these implications might mean. I'm going to stop there with regards to human rights due diligence and just unpack real quickly what the guiding principles are, in part because they haven't been mentioned yet, but also because it's surprisingly unheard. So there's a surprising number of people that have not yet heard about these guiding principles on business and human rights, even though the UN guiding principles, I'm going to start calling them the UNGPs from now on, even though the UNGPs are the world's first and arguably the most authoritative normative framework guiding responsible business practice today, they were unanimously approved of and or adopted rather by the Human Rights Council in 2011 after a 6-year consultation process that involved business, governments, and civil society actors. The guiding principles are divided into 31 principles and really under the heading of 3 different pillars. And what makes the guiding principle so unique is that it acknowledges that there's a shared goal here, but there's differentiated responsibilities between business and states. I'll leave that for now. Next slide will detail what these pillars are but I'm not going to go through every line of this. You can find the UNGPs online and do a review yourself. But this just demonstrates what the 3 pillars are. Yeah, state duty, corporate responsibilities, and the state and business responsibilities to provide for remedy. That third piece. Now, under that second pillar, if I could just stay on the slide for 30 seconds longer, this is where the second pillar is where human rights due diligence originates. And that's under principle 17 to 21. It describes 4 steps that Martina's already beautifully and elegantly covered in our conversation already. But take a look at the guiding principles. Understand they can be very prescriptive, very interesting ideas are there for states to pick up to push responsible business agenda and indeed for businesses to show their respect for human rights, including in the agriculture sector. Next slide, please. Now, just a little bit about the project or our program. We are actually in 39 countries. It's a program funded by the Japanese, by the European Union, and by the government of Sweden. In these 39 countries, next slide, please. We are supporting efforts in 14 Asian countries. Of these 14, my team or the project I'm managing is active in 7, and that involves Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Sri Lanka, and Mongolia. I could detail what the different experiences are here, but that's beyond the parameters of this webinar, just to know that agriculture figures very largely in each of the countries. And so does our work on biodiversity and human rights and environmental due diligence. Next slide, please. All right, so Asia in focus. What is this thing? What is he talking about? Asia in focus. Look, we got some supplementary funding halfway through our program initiation phase, and we were asked to simply give greater visibility. Raise awareness of these links between business, human rights, and the environment. And that supplementary budget couldn't have been more timely because as we were starting to deploy some of our new knowledge products, our video webcast series, our events, etc., the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment was endorsed by first the Human Rights Council and then the General Assembly, as you're well aware. So these awareness-raising products have really met and or exceeded the expectations of the UNDP, our partners, the EU, and others. We seem to have gotten the message that the 3 should be thought of in one bucket, or rather as a consolidated offer, consolidated issue. At about the right time, I encourage you to visit our website, which maybe Sheila can put in the chat box. So you could see the various reports and webcasts, YouTube webcasts that we've been hosting. And in this Asian focused webcast series, you'll know that we're asking hard questions. We're not trying to soft pedal things. We're not talking in normative jargon. We really want to know, we want to address the gaps in thinking. And so that's where the Asian focus or culture comes from. It's a very different kind of UN product than what you might be used to. All right, well, part of the Asian focus series is our work on things like biodiversity. Next slide. Our biodiversity work is informed in part through our partnership with Dalberg, but also because we have a very large biodiversity team based here in the office here in Bangkok. at the Bangkok Regional Hub, UNDP Asia Pacific's Regional Hub. We will be launching this report shortly, but some of the key findings are going to be provided by Rohit in a moment. I just want to scan the first few. There you go, Sheila. Thank you. Some big killer facts, as you may call them, that are familiar to many but not to all. Asia is host to 17 of 36 global biodiversity hotspots. 17, and it's a big region, but but it's still surprising that so many could be concentrated in one area. It's equally surprising and alarming, perhaps, that these hotspots are under the kind of threats that they are, because Asia also has the lowest percentage of protected areas among all regions globally. And so, in part, this also is because the progress on biodiversity and on conservation in Asia has been remarkably slower than the other regions. There's no real good reason for this. There are theories on why Asia is slower to pick up the conservation measures, slower and worse off under the Aichi targets than other regions. It's not for a lack of capital. It might be more of a lack of political will and sensitization. Protecting and restoring Asia's biodiversity, we're really at a critical stage now. 60% of mangrove forests, for example, have disappeared. 40% of Asia's coral reefs have disappeared. And there are other stats about virgin land forest cover. It goes on and on. It's striking how much has been lost in Asia in such a short time. And guys, food and agriculture business has been a big part of that. Not the only part, but a big part. And as Rohit will probably share, a disproportionate part of the loss of biodiversity in Asia. I promise I'm not going to cover a slide like this with you either. It's way too dense, but this will be in the report, and it shows at a glance what this nexus looks like between business, between biodiversity or ecosystems, and the human rights impacts. We unpack this in the report. We give color to what this means and what policies, prescriptions might be required for us to address adequately this nexus between business, human rights, and biodiversity. I think I'm coming up on my last slide here. Oh, indeed, recommendations. There are many recommendations that are coming out of the report that are linked to the agriculture area sector. I've highlighted a few that I think are important. We really do need to take a collaborative approach in policy design. We need to come up with, we need to can't enforce, but we need to really encourage policy coherence, because this is really where a lot of deforestation, a lot of overfishing, a lot of impacts on biodiversity are happening, because one ministry has one set of orders, another ministry will have another set of orders that and or incentives that run counter to that. So policy coherence is very critical. Specific sector level reporting mandates are also important. Different sectors have different requirements. One size fits all to reporting and disclosures, for example, is not very helpful. Next slide. Mandating public reporting in the first place. This should be like a no-brainer, and I almost feel like there should be a benchmarking of countries, business and human rights benchmarking or biodiversity benchmarking system, and where countries are mandating public reporting, they're higher up on the list of the countries that where business should feel a little less risk and a little bit more, how should I say, encouragement to do business, where in fact mandatory reporting is necessary, is required by the state. Of course, access to information. There's a lot of data out there. There's not a lot of data that you want, though, to help you understand where risks lie and where you should place investments as a large buyer. There's not enough data out there to support ESG, let alone the kind of data that we need to understand the kinds of impacts that specific companies in specific sectors are having. All right, so these are just a few of the recommendations that are coming out of this rather large report that we're doing at UNDP in collaboration with Dalberg. Thank you very much for your time. A couple of QR codes here if you want to follow us on Twitter or go to our Knowledge Hub. Thank you very much, and back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sean. Now, I right away give the floor to Rohit, who will deep dive into the agri-food sector. Rohit, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Greta. Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for having me here today. I will keep my presentation a little brief because I think Sean has done a fantastic job of talking through at least the objectives and the tone of some of the big recommendations and messages coming out of our report. Yes, I think the headline is the situation is quite critical. It's quite dire. And I think, what we really tried to do, and even exploring that nexus of biodiversity, business, and human rights that Sean quickly articulated for us, is really make that real in the context of the sectors that are really at the heart of both the problem and the solution in the context of Asia Pacific. And the agri-food sector is very much top of that. One finding from our report that the agri-food sector actually accounts for over 50% of the man-made pressure on biodiversity globally. And in Asia, that obviously holds truer than any other region. I think the latest data from the World Bank shows that in the region, the share of agriculture, allied services is often upwards of 10% of a country's GDP on average, compared to around 4% for the global average. So it's quite a stark difference, right? Which basically means production over a larger expanse of land, more resources used more intensely, and overall greater scale of impact, overall impact of biodiversity. Now, Sean kind of teed up some of this already in his voiceover, but a lot of the discourse around that impact has really anchored around how agriculture drives deforestation, especially for clearing cropping rights. Deforestation not only diminishes the naturally available stock of natural resources that are provisioned by forests, timber, medicinal plants, game animals, and so on, but also, as we know, can also diminish the regulating functions that are typically delivered by these ecosystems. Air quality through the creation of natural carbon sinks, for example. And Southeast Asia, as we know, has one of the highest rates of deforestation globally in the world, with, I think, 30–40% of it actually linked to logging, shifting agriculture, and so on and so forth. However, and this is kind of a big message that the report really tries to drive home, is that while deforestation and indeed land use more broadly is undoubtedly a massive driver of how farming and agribusiness are kind of contributing to and potentially risk deepening biodiversity loss in the region, the problem is indeed much broader. It's an entire value chain wide issue, as many of the speakers today have spoken to. And that, to me, is a key point that our report tries to drive home. Biodiversity risks in agriculture, because of many sectors, are perhaps way more varied than perhaps we realize, and certainly not limited to deforestation. We can look a bit deeper. If you think about the agri-food sector, as many of you kind of deeply involved in the space, you have an upstream kind of crop cultivation, animal husbandry, dairying, and so on and so forth. You have midstream activities which are more for processing, packaging, and so on and so forth. And then finally, you have the downstream delivery from farm to table. Overall, I think what we're finding is that your upstream activities are indeed where the burden is greatest. Obviously, there's the issue of land use. How much land is being used at what rate resources are being consumed, and areas being cleared, ecosystems are being torn down for agricultural use. But there's also, in the Asian context very specifically, a very real question for how that land is then used. And I'll share a couple of examples. The first big one is water use. Your climatic and soil conditions in many parts of the region are actually unfavorable to agriculture, which manifests in practice in a very heavy reliance on irrigation. Asia accounts for as much as 70% of the world's total area under irrigation, and I think 40% of that is in China and India alone, which puts a massive drain on freshwater resources in a region where many people already face steep water insecurity, right? Similarly, pesticide use, right? And this is something that I think especially applies for your larger landholders, your larger farmers. Obviously, Asia has a variety of different, scales of operators, but with these larger holders who are often the primary participants, as we found in the value chains of large agri-food businesses, those farmers have the capital, the technology, the resource to deploy a large amount of pesticide in a more intensive way compared to smallholders. And indeed, there are many studies, notably a 2019 study of rice farmers we found in China, that kind of that substantiate that. That contaminates soil quality, which is not a surprise to any of us, but also leads to runoffs that contaminate freshwater marine ecosystems. They create significant imbalances in local food chains. For example, the animals, the spiders, beetles, birds, whatever, that kind of use that soil, that water for their own nourishment and their own kind of survival. They may be curtailed, which leads to the kind of incidence of pests. This may seem very technical, so let me kind of pull us back a little bit and say what this means, which is that the impacts of agricultural activity, business activity more broadly, is that the ripple effects are often so much larger than we may realize. Take the pesticide example I mentioned above. Said we know that pesticides are going to erode soil quality, but the second and third order risks, contamination of fresh water, disruption of food chains, are very difficult to identify outright. Equally, they're important to find. Beyond that, as I said, massive set of midstream activities, processing, milling, packaging, food delivery, retail, kind of the downstream value chain, which also kind of have significant impacts in terms of emission and energy use. But all to say, I think the most important thing is that this is indeed a very diverse set of issues. I think the stakeholders involved as well are very diverse. In primary production, you have many more smallholders. As you kind of move downstream, markets tend to consolidate. And the kind of takeaway from that is there is a bit of a differentiated approach that we need. And indeed, that is spelled out in a lot more detail in the recommendations the report makes. But maybe I'll leave a couple of almost parting thoughts, design principles, which really stood out to me based on this very quick summary and our much longer research and analysis into the agri-food sector. The first, as I said, risks can crop up across the value chain. They may be very obvious or less obvious, but what you need is a strong approach for identifying risk, taking steps to mitigate those risks, and continuously revisiting the effectiveness of those mitigations. So for our part, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, actually recently released recommendations around how you might do this to locate your interface with nature and kind of manage that risk via the LEAP framework. We've actually seen one case study of an Asian conglomerate with interest in the tea sector with a number of estates in Sri Lanka in particular, which used the framework to identify risks across their value chain beyond things like deforestation or land clearing. They realized that the two biggest impacts of their business was, number one, that they were displacing a lot of the endemic animal species in the region, which is creating imbalances in local flora and fauna. And secondly, that the way they were actually farming was degrading soil quality, the quality of local ecosystems. This whole approach helped them identify opportunities to create green corridors for endemic animal species, to work towards and acquire sustainable farming certifications, to make sure they were both up to standard as well as marketable, especially to customers in other markets, right? So there is kind of a proof of concept for this. But mandates are not enough, nor are they effective on their own. As I said, industries are diverse. So I think the need really is for large players to take the lead, both in terms of role modeling, what responsible business looks like at the intersection of biodiversity and human rights, but also guiding value chain actors towards doing this. The CSDDD initiative is great because it kind of creates economic incentives for larger players to align to a certain standard of doing things. But equally so, economic incentives for even smaller farmers, mid-sized farmers, so they're responsive to those behavior change pushes. Technology transfer, capacity building, as Mary was saying, greater equity to resource access for those smaller enterprises that take on ownership of this very difficult man in terms of both managing and kind of doing business more responsibly, as well as kind of tackling the risks. There's an argument that these things are not mutually exclusive, they need to happen together. For example, we heard about one case study in the coffee sector in Indonesia, where a particular organization spent several years socializing a focus on responsible production in their value chain, and then moved to kind of securing and articulating commitments. So all to say, it's a breadth of risks, it's a very diverse sector, and it's a bit of a differentiated approach. But we do hope that you'll find the report that Sean spoke through and that I've kind of shared the findings from will help make sense of some of that clutter. and bring at least some clarity to how to think about this issue. I'll start there.
Thank you very much, Rohit, also for keeping it brief. So we reached the top of the hour. Apologies if we don't have additional time to respond to comments or questions, but please, if you still have some questions, put them in the chat, and we will respond through in our post-event email. I hope the event was informative and interesting to you. I thank again our speakers for contributing, thanks again for all of you to participate in this event, and we wish you a good rest of the day. Thanks again. Bye.